But tonight, we're here to celebrate. We celebrate that this company's been here for 40 years. We can celebrate that this year's been one of our best ever in 40 years. And we should all come together and celebrate that. Very few companies make it for 40 years. We need to give thanks for that. And we've had a great year in 2010 when most companies have not. We have to give thanks for that and celebrate that. To understand where we are now, I think it's important that everyone on our team understand where we came from, how did we start, how did we grow, who made it happen, why are we here. I saw a quote recently, it was on the Vistage website, Ed. Said Peter Drucker said, "Whenever you see a successful business, someone made a courageous decision." And that was true 40 years ago. My granddad, T.A. Parker, made a courageous decision when he retired at age 56 to start our company. My grandma made a courageous decision to support his decision and believe in him. He left a stable job as a crew leader for a strong company and put together $10,000, his whole life savings at that time, and struck out to make his dream a reality. So who were my grandparents, Almus and Eleanor Parker? Some of you knew them, but most of y'all didn't. Granddad was one of 7 children. During his early childhood, his family lived as sharecroppers or tenant farmers on a farm north of Montgomery. Their home was small and not very well made. Granddad used to laugh as he remembered he could see chickens running underneath the house through the cracks in the floor. He took me to the area one day and showed me where the house was, and the one-room schoolhouse, the Pine Flat School of Knowledge, that was still standing back in the 80s. Well, in 1926, the Parker family moved to Birmingham, seeking work when Granddad was about 12. Birmingham was the magic city. It was booming, the industrial mills, and in 9th grade, Granddad left school and went to work in the mills to help the family make ends meet during the Great Depression. He got a job at Chicago Bridge and Iron in 1932, where he worked in maintenance and welding, and later worked his way up to foreman over heat treating and testing. He met a pretty young lady named Eleanor Mann, and they were married in 1933. My grandmom was raised by a hardworking single mom, my great-grandmother, Katie Mann, and they lived with cousins because Nanny didn't make enough at her job at Royal Cup Coffee to have her own place. Grandmom and Nanny lived with Nanny's sister's family. My grandmom grew up with her 3 cousins. One was my Aunt Ruth, Sam's mom, and we could tell stories about Grandmom and Aunt Ruth and their gallivanting and escapades for the rest of the night. But in 1935, my mom was born. And through the Great Depression and World War II, they were a typical working family in Tarrant City, working in the steel industry and enjoying life with family, friends, and church at the center. In the late 50s, Granddad told me he put an idea that he had in his head down on paper. He drew a picture of a little office building and a stress relief furnace, and he put the picture up where he'd see it every day. And from that day, for the next 10 years, he'd tell me every move, he'd make a little step toward that dream. Remember one story he told me, he saw a building that stood in the right-of-way for a freeway, and he asked the owner if he could take it down, if he could have it. And he put it under his garage, and probably 10 years later, he brought it out and put it up, and that became his first office at Pinson Valley Heat Treating, and it's still the break room today for the Standard Department. He saw his company that he worked for throwing away one-shot thermocouple wire, and he asked if he could have it to tie up beans. Well, he might have tied up a bean or two with it, but mostly he rolled it up and put it in his garage and saved it. And for 10 years, Pinson Valley Heat Treating never had to buy a thermocouple. And every step he made, he saw little things that took him toward that picture, that dream. Well, in 1969, after 10 years of taking little steps, he decided to take the big step. And with no job, $300 a month of a pension, and $10,000 and no credit, he drove all over town looking where he could put up a stress relief furnace and get in business. Everyone wanted more than he could pay, and Granddad prayed that he would find the land he needed that he could afford. Well, one day, driving out in the country on a Sunday afternoon, north of Tarrant City in Pinson, he met a man with a pig farm, Dad Hill. Well, Mr. Hill and Granddad really hit it off, and Mr. Hill agreed that he'd rent my granddad 1 acre of land on Sunrise Drive for $1 a month until Granddad could get going and afford more. And on a handshake, they decided that whenever Granddad started making money, he'd pay him what he could afford. So a bulldozer was hired to level the property, and Granddad put up the little metal building he'd been keeping under the garage. And he began buying steel and cutting and welding it to make furnace number 1, which is still in use today. I was 11 years old when my granddad opened Pinson Valley Heat Treating Company on November 3rd of 1970. I treasure my memories of the company and my grandparents during my childhood and college years. I would come to work during summers. When I was 12, I worked for 3 weeks and was paid $1 an hour. And I blew every bit of it, $120. I made signs and painted things. I think some of the labels are still on some of the switch boxes in the building. 480 volts. I think if you see poor handwriting, 480 volts, that's what I did when I was 12. I bought a Schwinn Continental, a yellow Schwinn Continental bicycle, $120. My mom and dad might have had to pay the tax on it. And I took that bike to Auburn and used it to ride from the Sigat House up to the engineering building years later. I still think when I drive up in the mornings up Pinson Valley Parkway about riding up with my granddad in his pickup truck. Sun would be coming up, and it was about 6:30 usually in the morning, an hour I didn't realize people were up until I started working summers with him. And we'd go through farms and dairies at the time that were up through Pinson Valley Parkway to the plant. And Granddad never turned on the radio. I don't know why he bought a radio with his car, because he never used it. And he really didn't talk a whole lot. He always was singing or whistling. And one song that he always performed every day was How Great Thou Art. And they were all gospel songs. He loved to sing and whistle gospel songs, and he was really good at it. And those summers he taught me how to weld, run a forklift, crane, run a furnace, cut steel with a blowtorch, and many other things a teenager usually doesn't get to learn. And I was so green he even had to teach me righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. I didn't know. One day he was telling me to loosen this nut, and I was going the wrong way with it, and he said, "What are you doing, boy?" And I said, "I'm trying to loosen that nut." And he said, "Well, why do you go that way?" I said, "Well, I go this way. If it doesn't work, I go the other way." And then he had to tell me that there was actually a plan behind it that would work every time. So, but he taught me a lot of things, and he told me a lot of stories about things that happened at the bridge. And James and I were talking about every one of those stories. It wasn't just a story; they always had lessons. And he loved to laugh, and he and Grandmom thought of all the employees and truck drivers, customers, everybody that came in, they thought of like family. And they loved to visit with everybody, and seemed like we just had more time for that back then. And Grandmom had a way about her that she could get people to tell her anything. And she'd sit there and talk to them until they did. But she was really interested in people, and she always made us eat. She didn't want anybody to be skinny. She'd always have something for you to eat. But it did seem like we had more time back then for stuff. We even had time after we'd get the furnaces going. We had a little garden back behind the furnaces. And I've just never seen so much food come out of a little piece of dirt. Grandmom was a great cook, and my dad could never figure out why her green beans were just so much better than the green beans we could cook in Atlanta. And one day they tried to trick my dad, and they told him that my mom brought some green beans home from Birmingham to Atlanta and fed them to him. And he said, "Now that's what I'm talking about. You finally figured it out." And she had to throw her hands up and say, "Well, they came from Birmingham." We finally decided it was the water in Birmingham did something to them. We don't know. But as it ended up, they needed that little garden just to survive. His old company decided that the little company out in Pinson was in competition with him, and they cut off his pension, hoping that he would give up and close his business. His $300 a month pension, and the company wasn't really making much money at the time. But Granddad kept that letter from the company cutting his pension off. He kept it up in front of his desk, and every month he'd take a little piece of paper out, and he'd write how much he'd add $300-something to it, and get the new total and tape it back up to that frame. And until the day he died, he had the total of what that company owed him. And one day when he used to work at the building was over by the airport, still there today, and they did close that facility, and he and I were over there at an auction where they were auctioning off all the equipment, and he said, well, they said I was in competition. I guess I finally put them out of business. And but the little garden made sure that they had food on the table. And there was so much food that every day customers and employees would take bags of vegetables home with them. And then he'd take 2 or 3 big bags home, and Grandmom would cook some for dinner. She'd take some out maybe for the next few days, and Granddad would divide the rest into bags and put them into more sacks. And on the way to work the next morning, we'd drive through Tarrant City, and he'd stop in front of the little house, and he'd say, Don, go put that bag up on the front porch. And I'd run up there, and I'd put it on the front porch, and I'd come back, and he'd say, there's a sick person in that house. And then we'd drive a little further, and I'd run up, and I'd put another one, and he'd say, that's a widow woman. And I don't think anybody ever knew how those vegetables showed up, who gave them to him. He never probably even told anybody. But he just loved doing that. And he always told me, you can't outgive the Lord, Don. You can't outgive the Lord. And he told me, every dime you get, every dollar you get, you give a dime back to God. You give a dime to Jesus. You give it to the church. You tithe, and God will never give up on you. God will make sure that you always have what you need. And he and Grandmom gave as natural as they breathed. They gave to the church. They bought a bus for their youth group. They supported the sheriff's boys and girls ranches, and they just loved young people. If you went in their house, they'd have tables with just pictures, school pictures of all these kids. And I wondered, did they have like another family with grandkids I didn't know about? But it was just all their church kids and people that they knew. People just loved them. And they got so much satisfaction out of seeing others benefit from the fruit of their little company. They got great joy out of seeing their employees able to buy a car or buy a house or start a family. And that just gave them a lot of joy. Well, I got out of college in 1981 and came into the business full time. And Granddad had assembled a great team of young guys and had trained them all in his way of doing things. And he taught us all to work hard, use our common sense and reasoning to solve problems, listen to your intuition. And his motto was good work, quick service at a fair price. Values that taught all of us who work for him and those values have become the foundation of our company values today. We've got the company values, and they're up, and we did them probably 10, 12 years ago, and I kind of went through this just to remind everybody, and I've kind of reworded them, taken a few of the buzzwords out, but this is what I believe we stand for. This is who I think we are.